The late afternoon sun poured through the lace curtains of my Charleston bungalow, painting the floorboards in long, golden stripes. I was sitting in my usual armchair, a teacup cooling between my palms, when the knock came. It was sharp, hurried, the kind of knock that belonged to my son. I opened the door, and there he was, Dorian, with his tall frame and a grin stretched too wide to be natural. He held an envelope, glossy and oversized, like something meant to impress. His eyes had that restless brightness, the same look he had when he was a boy trying to hide some scrape or lie. "Surprise, Mom," he said, lifting the envelope as though it were a trophy. My heart softened. He had never been the sentimental type, but in that instant, I imagined that perhaps he had turned a corner. Perhaps the son I had raised, the boy I'd carried through sickness and study, and all the lonely years after his father's death, had remembered me at last. He pressed the envelope into my hands, his fingers trembling with energy. "You've been so tired lately, always cooped up here. I thought it was time you had a real rest." I slipped the thick paper out. The tickets gleamed with the shimmer of blue waves printed along the edges. A Caribbean cruise leaving from Miami, stopping in Nassau, San Juan, and beyond. The kind of trip women in my bridge club dreamed of but never took. For a moment, tears burned my eyes. "Oh, Dorian," I whispered, pressing the envelope to my chest. "You shouldn't have." His smile grew tighter, but he kept nodding as though he needed me to keep speaking. "You deserve it. A whole week to yourself. Just you and the sea." I let out a laugh, shaky and wet, already picturing myself on deck, with the salt wind teasing my hair, sipping wine under a starlit sky. It felt like a gift of love, a recognition of everything I had poured into his life. And then, as my eyes skimmed the fine print, I caught it. A line at the bottom of the stub, small and almost hidden. "One way, solo cabin." The words snagged at my breath. "One way, solo." My hand trembled as I traced the letters, sure I had misread. But no, they were there, clear as the ink on a tombstone. I looked up. Dorian. "One way." For a flicker, his expression cracked. Then he laughed, too loud, too forced. "Oh, that printing error, Mom. Don't fret. You know how these companies mess things up. You'll get the return ticket on board, probably digital these days." I tried to smile, but something inside me had shifted. I knew the world of print, the habits of companies. 40 years as a librarian had taught me to trust the weight of words. They didn't make mistakes like that lightly. Still, I folded the ticket back into the envelope. "I see," I murmured, tucking it into my lap. "A silly error." He reached over, patting my knee. "Exactly. Don't overthink it. Just enjoy, all right. Let me do this for you." His hand was warm, but his touch lingered too long, as if to anchor me in his version of reality. I nodded, not because I believed him, but because my heart wanted to. I wanted so desperately to think this was love, not pity, not something darker. He talked about the ship's restaurants, the pools, the shows. I listened, nodded, asked questions in the right places, though my thoughts circled back to those two words. One way. The syllables pulsed behind my temples, like the beat of a drum. After he left, I carried the envelope into the kitchen and set it on the table. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I stared at the paper, the glossy waves on the edges, the promise of rest written in bold. But my gaze kept drifting back to the stub, those sharp little words carved into my peace of mind. I laid my palm flat on the ticket, pressing down, as if I could erase them. The paper crinkled under my hand, but the letters did not fade. One way. Solo cabin, And in that stillness, something colder than the evening breeze slipped into me, a whisper of doubt that would not leave. The next day, I told myself I would ask again. That night, the envelope lay on the kitchen counter, a silent guest between the salt shaker and my reading glasses. I had left it there deliberately, as if the paper itself needed to breathe before I could bear to touch it again. When I finally climbed into bed, the weight of those two words, "one way," pressed against my chest like a stone. But dawn brought a softer light, and with it, the familiar voice in my head that had always forgiven Dorian. I told myself he was careless, not cruel. He had never been good with details, and I had always been the one to catch them. Permission slips forgotten at school, overdue library books, tax forms left unsigned. Perhaps this was simply another oversight in a long line of them. As the kettle hissed, I let my thoughts drift backward the way an old sailor studies the wake behind his boat. I was 24 when the sea swallowed my husband. His fishing boat never returned from a storm that swept across the Atlantic. I remember holding Dorian's small hand at the pier, the gulls wheeling above us while neighbors whispered condolences. From that day on, it was the two of us against the tide. I worked nights at the library and mornings tutoring children in Latin just to keep food on the table. Every spare dollar went to him new shoes for basketball braces to straighten his teeth. Later, the tuition that carried him through Clemson. I still remember standing in line at the bursar's office, writing a check that nearly emptied my savings, telling myself it was an investment in his future, in ours. When he graduated, I thought my sacrifices had finally anchored him to something solid. But years slipped by, and he drifted from job to job, woman to woman. Still I kept faith. Mothers are stubborn creatures. We cling to the rope even when the boat at the other end is already half sunk. So when he handed me that cruise envelope, my heart leapt. For the first time, I imagined he was repaying me not with money, but with thought, with love. Maybe he had finally seen me not as the scaffolding that held his life together, but as a woman who deserved a rest. I carried that thought with me to the market the next morning. The ticket stub gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside, choosing instead to browse racks of sundresses I had no business buying. My reflection in the mirror startled me, a silver-haired woman in a lemon-yellowed dress, smiling shyly like a girl preparing for her first dance. I laughed at myself, though my eyes watered. At the perfume counter, I lingered over scents I hadn't worn since my 30s. The saleswoman dabbed one on my wrist, and the memory of moonlit walks with my husband flooded back the salt of the ocean on our lips. For a moment, I felt young again, as though time itself had looped back to give me one more chance at joy. By the time I reached the checkout, my basket brimmed with dresses, sandals, a wide-brimmed hat, even a bright red lipstick I would have once called scandalous. I swiped my card with trembling hands, telling myself that after decades of penny pinching, I had earned this splurge. Back home, I laid the items on my bed one by one, smoothing the fabric as if arranging treasures. The house felt different, lighter, as though anticipation itself had taken root in the walls. For the first time in years, I felt the thrill of looking forward, not back. The envelope still rested on the counter, its glossy surface catching the afternoon light. I picked it up, slid the ticket out again, and stared at the words that had unsettled me. One way. Solo cabin. My throat tightened, but I pressed the ticket against the pile of dresses, willing the bright colors to drown the dark undertones. I told myself this cruise was a gift, a bridge between past sacrifices and present gratitude. I told myself to believe in him, in us. And as the shadows lengthened across my bedroom, I whispered aloud, as if speaking, could make it true. This is his way of saying thank you. And with that, I folded the dresses carefully into my suitcase, trying not to notice how my hands still trembled. By the third evening, after receiving the envelope, my suitcase sat open at the foot of my bed, half filled with sundresses and sandals that still smelled faintly of store tags. I kept drifting toward it, smoothing fabrics, checking lists, reassuring myself I hadn't forgotten anything. But as I folded and refolded, the same question kept surfacing, tugging like a rope beneath the tide. Why wasn't Dorian coming with me? It had hovered at the edge of my mind since the moment he'd placed the tickets in my hands. A cruise wasn't the kind of gift you gave for solitude. It was meant to be shared dinners on deck dancing to jazz under the stars, excursions to colorful ports. The idea of me alone in a cabin marked solo gnawed at me. That night, as he dropped by to check on me, I asked, "Dorian," I said, keeping my tone light, "why don't you come along? We haven't traveled together in years. It would be lovely to have you there." He froze mid-step, then set his keys on the table with deliberate care. His eyes slid away from mine, studying a spot on the kitchen wall as if a secret had been painted there. "You know I'd love to," he began, his voice clipped, "but the firm can't spare me right now. We're in the middle of 3 big projects. If I disappear for a week, it could cost me my job." The words were rehearsed, delivered too quickly. I noticed the way his jaw tightened, the faint twitch near his temple that appeared when he was under pressure. "Can't they manage without you for just a few days?" I pressed. "Surely there are others who can step in. You deserve a break too." His gaze darted toward me, sharp and brief, then away again. He poured himself a glass of water, though the pitcher was nearly empty. "Mom, I'm serious. Architecture isn't like shelving books. Deadlines are brutal. Clients are demanding. If I'm not there, things fall apart." The comparison stung, though he didn't seem to notice. I bit back a retort, reminding myself that his work was stressful, that I had asked him a vulnerable question. Still, a shadow crept over me, darker than the dusk settling outside the windows. I studied his profile as he leaned against the counter, sipping his water too slowly. His shoulders were taut, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond me. It wasn't the face of a man burdened by loyalty to a job. It was the face of someone avoiding a truth. But mothers are practiced in forgiveness. I told myself he was exhausted, that stress etched harsh lines where none belonged. I told myself I was imagining distance where only duty stood. "You're right," I said, finally smoothing my skirt. "I'm being selfish. You've got responsibilities, and I should be grateful you thought of me at all." His shoulders eased slightly, though his eyes never met mine for more than a second. "Exactly. You'll enjoy it more on your own anyway. No one to fuss over. Just you and the ocean." I forced a smile, though the words landed cold. Alone with the ocean, it was meant to sound like paradise, but it rang instead like an echo from the ticket stub. Those 2 words I still hadn't shaken. One way. He glanced at his watch and gathered his things, muttering about an early meeting. At the door, he kissed my cheek, perfunctory, his lips cool against my skin. I watched him leave, the hollow click of the latch reverberating through the quiet house. In the silence that followed, I placed a hand over my chest, feeling the uneven rhythm of my heart. The question I had tried to silence returned stronger than ever, pressing against my ribs, unwilling to be dismissed. And though I told myself he was just tired, just overworked, the shadow of doubt had already anchored itself deep within me. 2 days later, I decided to make one last trip downtown to pick up a few things I had forgotten: sunscreen, a pair of comfortable walking shoes, a novel thick enough to last the week at sea. I promised myself I would take my time, linger over shop windows, maybe stop at the cafe near Meeting Street for a slice of lemon pie. Anything to distract me from the nagging unease that kept whispering whenever I looked at the envelope. But the errands took less time than I expected. The shops were quiet, the cashier quick, the streets still sleepy in the late morning haze. Within an hour, my bags were full, and my feet were already steering me back toward home. I hesitated at the corner, glancing at my watch. Dorian had said he wouldn't be by until evening. Perhaps I should stay out longer, sip that coffee, stretch the hours before returning to my silence. Yet some impulse habit maybe pushed me forward. When I reached the house, the front door was unlocked. My hand froze on the knob. Dorian had a key, of course, and it wasn't unusual for him to come by unannounced, but something about the faint hum of voices drifting from inside made my skin prickle. I stepped through the threshold quietly, letting the door close with barely a click. At first, I thought he had the television on, but as I moved down the hallway, the sound sharpened. His voice, his laughter. I stopped dead. It was not the laugh I knew, the boyish chuckle that once brightened my loneliest days. This laugh was thin, nervous, conspiratorial. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, straining to make sense of the words. Yes, he was saying the words punctuated by that hollow laugh. One-way ticket. Finally, free of her. The bag slid from my hand, spilling shoes and sunscreen onto the carpet. My breath caught jagged and painful. One-way ticket. Free of her. He was talking about me. The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold. For a moment, I thought I might faint collapse right there in the hall. My son, my only son, was laughing about sending me away for good. I pressed my hand to my mouth to smother the sound clawing up my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to storm into the room, demand an explanation, shake the truth out of him. But my body refused to move. I stood rooted to the spot, as though the house itself had turned into quicksand and swallowed me whole. His voice lowered too muffled to catch every word, but the rhythm told its own story. Pleading, persuading, laughing again. Whoever was on the other end, it was someone he trusted enough to share this cruel joke. I leaned my forehead against the cool plaster wall, struggling to breathe. 1,000 memories rushed through me at once, his small hand clutching mine on the pier, when we buried his father, the proud grin on graduation day, the tears he shed when I gave him my last savings to help with rent. All of it, twisted, tainted, shattered. The laughter floated again, sharp and unrecognizable. My knees buckled and I caught myself against the baseboard. That sound, it belonged to a stranger, not the boy I raised. I backed away, step by step, careful not to let the floorboards creak. My scattered shopping bag lay abandoned in the hall, but I couldn't bring myself to retrieve it. My only thought was escape, retreat, invisibility. At the back door, I slipped out into the yard, gulping the heavy Charleston air like a drowning woman. The world outside seemed too bright, too normal, the rustle of the magnolia tree, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. I clutched the railing of the porch, trembling, trying to steady myself against a truth too sharp to face. The house behind me held my son's voice, still murmuring, still laughing. Each syllable cut deeper than the last, and I knew in that terrible moment that the life I thought I had anchored was nothing but driftwood, already splintering on the tide. I lingered outside until the rhythm of his voice finally faded and the front door shut with a heavy thud. Only then did I gather enough courage to step back inside my shopping bag, still splayed across the hallway rug. I scooped the spilled shoes and bottles with trembling hands, forcing my breath to steady before he noticed I had returned. By evening, Dorian called to say he'd be over for dinner. My first instinct was to refuse to lock every door and let silence be my companion. But another instinct, older, sharper, warned me that to reveal suspicion now would be a mistake. If he believed me blind, I might still have the advantage. So I cooked, as I always did, pan-fried salmon with herbs from the garden, a salad dressed in olive oil and lemon. My hands moved mechanically, my mind circling his laughter, the words finally free of her. I set the table as though nothing in the world had shifted, though the weight in my chest told me everything had. When he arrived, he carried his usual air of casual charm, but I saw through it now. The smile too wide, the hugs too brief. He asked about my errands, and I recited the list of shops as though reading lines from a script. He nodded, pleased, unsuspecting. At the table, I made myself laugh at his small stories, nod at his accounts of projects at the firm. My voice rose and fell with practiced warmth, though my heart pounded so violently I thought it might shake the glassware. Between bites, I told him the salmon was perfect, that he had seasoned it just right. His chest puffed slightly with pride, the same way it had when he was a boy bringing home a school project for the fridge. But now I knew that pride was hollow. The boy I raised had drifted beyond my reach, and the man across from me was a stranger plotting my disappearance. I excused myself once to the kitchen, gripping the counter until the tremors in my hands subsided. I stared at the knives in their block, the silver glint catching the overhead light, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined how easy it would be to end the charade right there. But I closed my eyes, forced the thought away, and carried the dishes back to the table with a smile. He never noticed. He never looked closely enough to see the stiffness in my jaw, the tremor in my fingers as I lifted my fork. When the plates were cleared, he kissed my cheek goodnight, the gesture more routine than affectionate, and promised to stop by tomorrow to help me pack. I held the door for him, my smile steady, my body rigid. Only when his car pulled away did I let the mask slip. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the magnolia branches dancing across the plaster. My thoughts turned over and over like restless waves. Each memory of his childhood collided with the echo of his words on the phone. One way. Finally, free of her. Beneath the ache of betrayal, something new stirred a quiet resolve. I had survived storms before widowhood, years of scraping pennies together, nights of loneliness. I could survive this too, but not by collapsing, not by surrendering. So while the house remained silent, I began to plan. Not in detail yet, but in instinct. A woman alone could still be a woman prepared. I turned onto my side, pulled the quilt around me, and whispered into the darkness, a promise to myself I would not be erased. And by morning, I already knew the first step I would take. The first light of dawn seeped through the blinds, and I was already dressed. My suitcase remained open in the bedroom, clothes folded neatly inside, but it was not fabric I needed to secure. It was something harder, colder, something that would not vanish the moment I stepped on that ship. I drove across the quiet streets of Charleston, the roads nearly empty except for delivery trucks and the occasional jogger pounding the pavement. The credit union sat on the corner of Calhoun Street, its brick facade softened by ivy. I had been a customer there for decades, cashing paychecks, depositing birthday checks from my mother, saving for Dorian's college. Now I walked in with a different purpose entirely. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the fluorescent lights hummed. A young teller in a navy blazer looked up from his computer, startled by my early arrival. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" I slid my checkbook and ID across the counter. "I'd like to make a withdrawal." He smiled politely. "Of course." "How much, all of it?" His fingers stilled above the keyboard. "I'm sorry, I want to close out my accounts. The joint savings, my pension deposits, every cent. In cash." My voice came out steadier than I felt, each word sharp enough to cut through his hesitation. The teller blinked, glanced toward the glass office at the back, where the manager sat sipping coffee. "That's quite a lot of money to carry, ma'am." "Are you sure?" "Yes." I leaned forward, letting the weight of my stare rest on him. "I am sure." He swallowed, tapped at his keyboard, then excused himself to consult with the manager. I stood at the counter, palms damp against my purse, heart hammering against my ribs. For a moment, I imagined Dorian walking through the glass doors, his easy smile turning venomous when he realized what I was doing. But the doors stayed shut, and the silence pressed on. After several long minutes, the teller returned with the manager, a woman in her 50s who remembered me from years past. She gave me a careful look. "Mrs. Carraway, I just want to confirm you'd like the full withdrawal today. No transfers, no checks." "Cash," I said. "I'll take it all in cash." Her eyebrows lifted, but she nodded. "It will take a few minutes." I waited at a small table, my knees stiff, my pulse steadying with each breath. When the teller finally returned with a thick envelope, he slid it across the counter as though it were something fragile. The paper bulged rubber bands, keeping the stacks in place. I signed the final forms with a flourish, my hand not shaking once. The envelope was heavier than I expected. I tucked it into my purse, zipped the leather shut, and pressed the bag tight against my side. The weight grounded me. It was more than bills, it was protection. Freedom, a barrier against the sun, who thought he could erase me. The teller gave a cautious smile. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" "No," I said softly. "You've done enough." I walked out into the morning light, the air cool and damp against my cheeks. The traffic had begun to thicken, but the street still held the hush of early hours. My purse pressed against my ribs, with each step a secret shield no one else could see. By the time I reached my car, a strange calm had settled over me. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't waiting for the floor to fall out beneath me. For the first time since hearing his laughter, I felt I had something solid to stand on. I slid into the driver's seat, buckled my belt, and placed my hand over the purse as though blessing it. Then I started the engine, ready to face whatever came next. The drive to Miami stretched long and heavy, though Dorian did his best to fill it with chatter. He spoke of office deadlines of a colleague who had bungled a blueprint of property values rising in Charleston. His words tumbled out with practiced ease, but I noticed how often his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, as if searching for something hidden in my expression. I kept mine composed, folded neatly like the clothes in my suitcase. Each nod, each polite question was measured. I laughed once at a joke I hardly heard, my voice a shade too thin, but he didn't seem to notice. Perhaps he was too focused on the road, or perhaps he wanted so badly to believe in my ignorance that he couldn't see the cracks in my smile. The envelope of cash lay buried deep in my handbag at my feet, its weight a constant reminder that I had not surrendered, not yet. With every mile south, I pressed my toes against the carpeted floor mat, feeling the vibration of the car, willing myself to remain steady. We stopped only once at a roadside diner off I-95. Over watery coffee and a plate of eggs, I studied him. He scrolled his phone between bites, the glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. There was a nervous tension in his shoulders he tried to disguise with casual shrugs. When he caught me looking, he smiled too brightly and asked if I was excited for the adventure. Yes, I answered, steadying my tone. I can't thank you enough. His relief was almost palpable. He reached across the table, squeezing my hand briefly before returning to his phone. I smiled back, my nails digging into my palm beneath the tablecloth. By the time we reached Miami, dusk had begun to settle, painting the horizon in bands of coral and violet. The port buzzed with energy, families dragging suitcases, couples snapping photos, luggage carts rattling over pavement. Cruise ships loomed like floating cities, their lights glittering against the water. Dorian pulled the car to the curb and lifted my suitcase from the trunk. His movements were brisk, efficient, like a man eager to finish a task. He hugged me quickly, arms stiff around my shoulders. "Enjoy yourself, Mom," he said, his voice warm, but his eyes cool. "Don't worry about a thing." I tilted my head, kissed his cheek softly, and caught the faintest whiff of cologne, masking a sour edge of sweat. The gesture was deliberate, an echo of affection I no longer felt. Inside, disgust curled tight in my chest, but outwardly, I wore the serene mask of a grateful mother. He stepped back, satisfied, reassured that I had swallowed the story whole. I watched him climb into the car, the red tail lights glowing as he merged back into traffic. Only then did I turn toward the waiting ship, my suitcase rolling behind me. The line at check-in moved quickly, the clamor of voices blending into a tide of excitement. I handed over my ticket, the agent scanning it without comment, then accepted the plastic key card to my cabin. One way, it had said. But the truth was heavier in my purse, folded into an envelope of bills. A secret lifeline he knew nothing about. Crossing the gangway, I felt the ship beneath my feet, solid yet alive, humming with engines that promised distance. The air smelled of salt and oil, and the horizon stretched wide, endless, indifferent. I gripped the rail as we pulled away from the port, the city shrinking behind me, its lights fading into a scatter of gold. Somewhere beyond that skyline, my son believed he had rid himself of me. But as the sea opened before me, I knew this was not exile. This was the threshold of something else, entirely the stage on which I would choose my rebirth. The ship moved steadily through the waves, its rhythm a constant undercurrent that followed me no matter where I went. That first morning, sunlight poured over the decks, dazzling against the polished rails. Laughter rose from clusters of passengers, already dressed in swimsuits and sun hats, chasing cocktails, as though the world offered nothing but pleasure. I joined the crowd at the buffet, filling a plate with eggs fruit and a croissant that flaked beneath my fork. The dining hall was a carnival of sound children begging for pancakes, couples clinking glasses of orange juice, waiters weaving between tables. I sat near a window, the sea unfurling outside, like a promise I wasn't ready to trust. I chewed slowly, trying to let the food anchor me to something ordinary. But each bite carried a shadow. In my mind, I heard his laughter again, that thin alien sound. One-way ticket. Finally, free of her. The words clung tighter than salt air, circling me even in the brightness of morning. After breakfast, I walked the decks, letting the sun warm my shoulders. I watched families pose for photographs against the endless horizon. Children leaned over the rail to point at dolphins, their voices shrill with delight. I pressed my hands to the railing and forced myself to breathe deeply. The wind rushed over my face, whipping strands of hair loose from their pins, tasting of brine and possibility. For moments at a time, I almost felt it, the sense of release, of distance from the shadows that clung to Charleston. But then memory returned, slicing through the calm, and I gripped the rail tighter. Freedom still felt like something borrowed, fragile, easily snatched away. Later, I found a quiet deck chair and lowered myself onto it, a paperback open in my lap. Around me, strangers basked in the sun, their bodies glistening with lotion and sweat, their laughter spilling over the hum of the engines. I read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a word. The pages blurred, replaced by visions of Dorian's face, the curl of his lips as he spoke those words into the phone. I closed the book and reached for my journal instead. Its leather cover was worn soft by years of use, the edges darkened by time. I uncapped my pen and let it hover above the page. The ship rocked gently, and my hand began to move. "One way for him, not me," I wrote. The letters slanted unevenly, my grip too tight, but the words steadied me. I underlined them twice, pressing so hard the ink bled through the page. It was not exile, I reminded myself. He might have plotted my erasure, but I still had my own script to write. The hours slipped by. I ate lunch in silence, then walked again along the rail, each step slower, more deliberate. The ocean whispered in every crash of water against steel. Its voice was vast and endless, a reminder of how small I was, but also how uncontained. By evening, the horizon burned with the orange flare of sunset. The ship's lights flickered on, brightening the decks as music swelled from the lounge below. Passengers clapped along to a jazz band, their voices rising in cheerful chorus. I leaned against the railing, the journal heavy in my hands, and read the words again. "One way for him, not me." I whispered them under my breath, letting the sound mingle with the sea breeze. My throat tightened, but my spine held straight. The ocean stretched out in every direction, limitless, indifferent to betrayal or grief. And as the night deepened, I realized the journey had only just begun. On the second evening of the voyage, I found myself in the ship's library, a quiet corner tucked between the cocktail lounge and a jewelry boutique. The shelves were lined with glossy travel books, worn paperbacks, and the faint scent of dust mixed with polish. I had come for silence, not company, but sometimes the two are inseparable. A man sat at the table across from me, tall with a shock of white hair and a weathered tan. He wore a linen jacket and glasses that he removed now and then to polish absent-mindedly. When he noticed me flipping through a collection of short stories, he gave a courteous nod. "First time cruising?" he asked, his voice low and even touched with a drawl that suggested coastal Carolina. "Yes," I said, closing the book gently. "And you?" he smiled faintly. "Retired maritime lawyer. Spent half my life on ships like this, but in courtrooms instead of deck chairs. Name's Amos Lewin. I introduced myself, though I gave only my first name. Something about him was disarming, yet I had learned quickly not to offer more than necessary. We spoke easily for a while. Ports we'd visited, books, we preferred the strange intimacy of strangers confined together at sea. His manner was calm, practiced the kind of voice that once carried authority in negotiations. It was only when I mentioned Charleston that his brow lifted. "Charleston, you say, fine city?" "I handled a case there years back involving an architectural firm. Fellow by the name of Caraway Dorian, I believe. Wouldn't happen to be any relation." My breath caught. My fingers tightened on the spine of the book, though I kept my tone even. "He's my son." Amos leaned back, exhaling softly, as though turning over a memory. "Well, I'll be. Small world." He hesitated, then said carefully, I remember him because he was in a bind. Real estate dispute entangled with gambling markers. Not the kind of trouble a man digs out of easily. The room seemed to tilt. Gambling. He nodded, his expression grave. Heavy debts. To the wrong sort of people. The firm wanted no part of it, of course, but his personal choices bled into the contracts. I did my best to negotiate a settlement, but the man was already drowning. Some debts can't be washed away by charm. The words clanged in my ears. Pieces of a puzzle shifted into place the late nights he'd excused as work the phone calls cut short when I entered a room, the nervous edge in his smile. This betrayal wasn't born from impulse or sudden cruelty. It was desperation, the kind that corrodes slowly until it eats through blood and bone. I forced myself to breathe. And the debts. Are they still? I couldn't say. Amos interrupted gently. It's been some time. But men who gamble like that rarely change course. They chase losses until there's nothing left to chase. He slipped his glasses back on and studied me. Forgive me if I've said too much. I forget sometimes that not all conversations are meant for court. I shook my head, though my heart pounded. No, you've said just enough. We let the silence settle after that, both retreating into our books. But my eyes never touched the page. My thoughts churned, each wave striking harder against the fragile walls I had built since stepping aboard. Dorian's laughter on the phone replayed itself with cruel clarity. One-way ticket. Finally, free of her. It hadn't been casual spite. It had been calculation. A drowning man clawing for air, willing to pull his mother beneath the waves if it meant he could breathe. I closed the book and rose from the table, offering Amos a polite goodnight. My legs carried me down the corridor, though I hardly felt the ship sway beneath me. By the time I reached my cabin, I understood something with bone-deep certainty. This voyage was not just a gift twisted into betrayal. It was the result of a plan, one born of debts I had never seen, but was now expected to pay. The next morning, the ship slowed as we neared Nassau, and for the first time since leaving Miami, my phone caught a signal. It began almost immediately, the buzzing, the flashing screen, the relentless cascade of notifications that seemed to rattle the small cabin walls. I picked it up with hands that did not tremble. The first missed call showed Dorian's name, then another, then another. By the time I scrolled through, there were more than 30. Each voicemail notification was a reminder of his unraveling, each message left behind like a footprint in quicksand. I sat on the edge of the bed, the leather journal open on the nightstand beside me. The words I had written the night before stared back. One way for him, not me. They steadied me as I pressed play on the first voicemail. Mom, his voice snapped brittle with irritation. Why aren't you answering? Call me back right now. The next one came moments later, sharper, louder. I know you're getting these. Don't ignore me. Then his tone shifted. Mom, please. I didn't mean for things to sound the way they did. You're overthinking. Call me. Another buzz. If you don't answer, you're making this harder than it needs to be. And then darker still. You don't understand what I've risked. Don't make me regret this. I listened to a dozen of them, one after another, the emotions twisting like a rope pulled too tight, anger pleading manipulation threats. Each word was a thread unraveling the mask he had worn so carefully. The boy I once knew was gone, replaced by a man who couldn't contain the desperation boiling in his chest. I pressed the phone against my thigh, staring at the patterned carpet beneath my feet. For a moment, the old instinct flickered inside me to call back, to soothe him, to untangle whatever knot he had made. It was the instinct of a mother honed over decades, but it was also the trap that had kept me blind for too long. Another buzz. Another voicemail. I imagined him pacing jaw-tight phone clutched in his hand, convinced he still controlled the narrative. But here, out at sea, the distance was mine to command. I scrolled to the settings and powered the phone off. The screen went black, the silence immediate and complete. A calm settled over me, spreading like warm water through my chest. For the first time in days, I felt in control. I rose, tucked the phone into the drawer beneath the nightstand, and picked up my journal again. My pen moved across the page without pause. His words are noise. Mine are anchor. Closing the journal, I stood and drew the curtains wide. The port of Nassau shimmered in the distance, its pastel buildings glowing beneath the Caribbean sun. Passengers bustled around me in the corridor, laughter spilling from every direction, oblivious to the storm I had silenced with the press of a button. As I stepped out onto the deck, the breeze caught my hair. Salt heavy and warm. I leaned against the rail, staring at the approaching shoreline. Behind me, my phone lay powerless in the drawer, and with it, his voice. The sea stretched wide between us now, and I had no intention of narrowing it. After wandering the bright streets of Nassau, with the other passengers pretending to admire jewelry in shop windows, tasting slices of fresh pineapple from street vendors, smiling politely when strangers tried to draw me into their laughter, I returned to the ship with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The port was lively, a blur of color and chatter, but inside, I remained apart, watching everything through glass. By the time I reached my cabin, the corridor was quiet. The steady thrum of the engines filled the silence, a reminder that the ship never truly rested. I bent to slide my key card into the lock and noticed a small white envelope lying against the threshold, its edges curled as though it had been slipped there in haste. My stomach tightened. I lifted it carefully. There was no name on the outside, but the moment I opened it, the letters struck me like a blade. Mother, I know you're angry. Let's fix this. Don't embarrass me. The handwriting wavered, jagged and uneven, as though written with a trembling hand. Dorian's script, once neat and precise, from years of drafting plans, reduced to this frantic scrawl. I stared at the words until they blurred the ink, bruising the page like fingerprints pressed too hard. He had reached me. Not by phone this time, but by paper. Somehow, he had found a way to have this delivered, maybe through someone at the port or a crew member easily convinced by money. The thought that he could still breach the small walls I had built made my throat close. I sat on the edge of the bed, the letter limp in my hands. Let's fix this, as though betrayal could be patched with glue and polite words. Don't embarrass me, as though my silence was not just his hope, but his command. The anger rose slowly, like water heating in a kettle, until I felt it simmer at my temples. He was not apologizing. He was cornered, desperate to salvage his reputation, afraid that his carefully crafted mask might crack in public. It was not love he offered, but bait. I stood abruptly, carried the letter into the bathroom, and set it in the sink. For a moment, I hesitated, the paper trembling between my fingers. Old instincts tugged at me, the instinct to forgive, to soothe, to believe. But that voice had cost me too much already. I struck a match from the small box I carried in my toiletry kit, its sulfur scent sharp against the sterile air. The flame flared tiny but fierce. I touched it to the corner of the letter, and the paper curled instantly, blackening, shrinking into itself. The words vanished in seconds, consumed by orange tongues that licked the porcelain. Ash flaked and fell into the basin until only fragments remained fragile as snow. I turned on the tap and washed them away, the smoke dissipating into nothing. When the sink was clean again, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was flushed, my eyes glistening, but the lines around my mouth had hardened. I had not trembled. Not once. Back in the cabin, I opened my journal and wrote in deliberate strokes. Forgiveness is a leash. Tonight I cut it. I closed the book, slid it beneath my pillow, and lay down fully clothed. Outside, laughter drifted from the lounge where music played, muffled but persistent. I listened to it the way one listens to a storm from behind locked windows, aware of its presence, but untouched by its reach. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Dorian would realize his message had not bound me, had not even slowed me. And tomorrow, I would take the next step in ensuring that he never could. Morning broke bright over Nassau, the kind of light that makes color louder, pastel walls humming, roofs flashing like scales. I disembarked with the first wave, my handbag snug against my ribs, the journal tucked inside like a small beating heart. The streets near the port were already awake. Vendors setting out guava pastries, taxi drivers calling out destinations, music slipping from doorways. I kept my pace, steady eyes ahead. I had mapped it in my head during the night, not the obvious places, not the glossy storefronts that called to tourists with trinkets and duty-free perfumes, but something plainer, practical, almost invisible. 2 blocks off Bay Street, in a narrow lane shaded by breadfruit trees, I founded a travel agency with sun-faded posters in the window and a bell that chimed when I stepped in. A woman behind the counter looked up from a ledger. She wore reading glasses on a chain and a pink blouse gone soft at the seams. There was a fan in the corner, tracing lazy circles through the warm air. "Good morning," I said, setting my handbag on the counter. "I'd like to purchase a flight to Charleston, South Carolina." "Same day," she asked, already reaching for her keyboard. "Tomorrow," I said. "Early, if possible. I can connect anywhere." She clicked and scanned her fingers, moving with the calm assurance of someone who solves other people's tangles for a living. "We have 1 seat via Miami, leaves late morning. Arrival Charleston, early evening." Her eyes lifted. "You'll need your passport." I slid it across. "Cash only," I added, not apologizing for it. Her mouth tilted in a knowing half-smile. "No trouble." While she entered my details, I let my gaze rest on the posters, beaches and airplanes' arrows pointing elsewhere, promises of escape printed in blues and oranges. I had stood in rooms like this before, once for Dorian's first trip with the school band, once when my husband and I had planned a weekend we never took. Back then, the air had felt full of possibility and sweetness. Now it tasted like iron and resolve. "Here we are," the woman said, turning the screen so I could read. She quoted the fare, and I counted out the bills, my new language of certainty. She printed an itinerary, and a receipt, slid them into a clear sleeve, and stapled the edges neatly. "Keep this with your passport," she advised. "If anything changes, the airline contact is here. And there's a note, U.S. Customs in Miami, before your connection." I nodded, the words settling like stones in a pattern already laid. "Thank you." She looked at me a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing whether kindness should go further, then said only, "Safe travels, ma'am." Back outside, the heat pressed close, but my chest had opened. I didn't hurry. I bought a bottle of water from a cart and found a pocket of shade near a church wall. There, I slipped the plastic sleeve into my journal between last night's page and a much older entry written in a younger hand. The paper made a quiet sound as it slid into place, a soft, decisive click I felt all the way through me. I touched the cover the way some people touch a rosary. Not one way I thought the words forming without pen or ink. Not anymore. With the practical peace secured, I allowed myself small luxuries: a slice of coconut bread, still warm from the oven, a postcard for my own dresser, a minute to watch school children skip a chalked grid on the pavement and squeal when someone landed in the wrong square. Life had the nerve to continue, no permission, no pause. I took that as instruction and kept walking. The ship loomed at the end of the street, a white spine against blue sky. On the gangway, I felt the itinerary pressing through the journal against my palm, a shape like a key in a pocket you've checked twice and will check again. When the crew scanned my card, I smiled with the absent grace of any returning passenger. Inside, I moved through familiar corridors past the boutique, past the quiet library to my cabin, where the air was cool and smelled faintly of citrus. I locked the door, drew the curtains, opened the journal, and looked at the sleeve again, not to confirm, but to memorize. One document for a future no one else had chosen. One line of type that said, I would step off this story under my own power. I slipped the journal beneath my pillow, then sat on the edge of the bed and breathed slow and even until the pulse at my neck matched the slow, certain thrum of the engines. Somewhere in Charleston, the magnolia branches would be scraping my bedroom window. Somewhere in Miami, a plane would be fueling for a flight that finally belonged to me. I closed my eyes and saw gates opening along the path like small, patient mouths. By late afternoon, the horn sounded for departure. I went to the rail with the others and watched Nassau tip backward, roofs and palms shrinking to toy box size. The wind lifted my hair. The sea received us without comment. I kept one hand on the rail and one over the journal pressed flat against my side. Night was gathering when the last line fell away, and as the water widened, I thought of Dorian on some sidewalk in Charleston, or in a store he favored reaching for a card that no longer answered to him, the first crack of shock spidering across his face. That night, after dinner, I climbed the stairs to the upper deck, where the wind was strongest and the crowd thinner. The air carried salt and the faint perfume of spilled rum from the bar below. The sky stretched wide, a deep navy scattered with stars that looked close enough to pluck. I walked slowly along the rail, my journal pressed against my side, beneath my shawl, as if I needed its weight to remind me of the promise folded inside. The sea was endless, dark, and alive, and for the first time since the envelope landed in my lap, I felt something stirring that wasn't fear. It was lighter, sharper, something like power. I pictured Charleston the bank, the polite teller sliding the receipt across the counter, his eyes flickering with surprise. I imagined Dorian that very evening, standing at a register in some glossy restaurant, a companion by his side ordering wine he couldn't afford. He would hand over his card with that same careless confidence I'd seen 100 times before. And then the pause, the frown, the quiet words. I'm sorry, sir. It's been declined. The image bloomed inside me, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting as if the failure were in the machine, not himself. He'd try again, maybe with another card, only to find the same rejection. I leaned over the rail, the sea rushing beneath like black silk, and let the wind lift a laugh out of me. It startled me, sharp and sudden, but it was mine, born from years of silence now breaking loose. I could almost hear his voice in the aftermath, angry and shrill. He would storm from the table phone pressed to his ear, demanding answers from the bank. They would confirm it politely, perhaps even gently, every cent withdrawn by me. No mistake. No glitch. Just a mother taking back what she had always given too freely. The thought carried me like a tide. his fury, his disbelief, his scramble to contain the humiliation. It was a theater I didn't have to attend. The scene played itself out in my mind while I walked the length of the deck, the stars above shifting like an audience leaning closer. For years I had carried the weight of his choices, paid the bills when he faltered, softened the truth when he failed, lifted him up when he stumbled. But now he was stumbling alone, and I was watching from the safety of distance. Each imagined moment of his unraveling loosened another knot inside me. I stopped near the bow where the wind was fiercest and closed my eyes. The ship surged forward, cutting through waves that sprayed a fine mist across my cheeks. The laughter came again, quieter this time, but steadier, anchored. People passed behind me, wrapped in their own holidays, couples pointing at constellations, children darting between deck chairs. But I felt untouchable in that moment. My world had narrowed to two images, the sea stretching ahead, infinite, and Dorian's face cracking under the weight of his own greed. I pressed my palms flat against the rail, grounding myself. The steel was cold, the salt sharp on my lips, but my body hummed with something fierce and alive. This was not just survival anymore. It was reclamation. The years I had spent doubting myself, dismissing instincts, burying disappointment beneath excuses, each one broke away like foam trailing behind the ship. Above me, the moon cast its silver light across the waves, and I whispered to the water, to myself, "Not one way. Never one way." The words vanished into the wind, carried off, but still echoing inside me. And as the ship plowed deeper into the night, I knew the reckoning waiting in Charleston would be mine to command. The cruise ended with little ceremony. Passengers disembarked in clusters, dragging suitcases, snapping last-minute photos. I moved among them quietly, a single figure carrying nothing more than my journal and the suitcase I had packed before the storm broke. The air in Charleston was thicker than the sea breeze I had grown used to, but it wrapped around me like home soil. I hailed a cab and rode in silence the city, rolling past my window, both familiar and changed. The driver spoke of traffic and weather, but I answered only in nods. My mind was already at the house, bracing for what I knew would come. When the cab turned onto my street, I saw his car before I saw him. Parked crooked at the curb door, left slightly ajar, as though he had leapt from it in haste. The front porch light glared even in daylight. He stood at the bottom of the steps, pacing. Pale, frantic clothes, wrinkled hair uncombed. The sight of him startled me more than if he'd come out swinging with fists. He looked like a man undone. The moment I stepped from the cab, his voice cracked across the air. "Where is it, Mom? Where's the money? Do you have any idea what you've done?" I thanked the driver, calmly handed him his fare, and lifted my suitcase before turning toward the porch. Dorian's words battered me, but they slid off like rain against stone. "You humiliated me," he spat, following close. Cards declined, checks bouncing. "Do you know what people are saying? Do you know what I've lost because of you, because of me? Always because of me." I set the suitcase down on the first step and looked at him fully. His face was blotched with anger, his eyes wild. Behind the rage, I saw something else: fear. Fear that the world had seen past his facade, that the safety net he assumed I would always hold had finally been cut. He ranted on words, spilling in jagged bursts about debts unpaid, about threats he now faced. I let the noise pass over me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend. My silence was my shield, and with every second it grew heavier, stronger. Finally, he faltered his voice, breaking into uneven breaths. He looked at me, expecting me to crumble, to argue, to cry. But I only stood with the stillness I had learned from the sea, my hands resting on the suitcase handle, my gaze steady. The quiet stretched until even the cicadas seemed to pause. He shifted on his feet, his fury meeting something harder than resistance absence. He had no power against the silence, no weapon sharp enough to pierce it. I lifted the suitcase again and stepped past him up the porch into my house. His voice chased me, cracked and desperate, but I didn't answer. The door closed behind me with a calm, final click. Inside the house smelled of lemon polish and old wood, the same as it had for years, but it no longer felt like his place to stand. I set the suitcase by the stairs, turned, and found him in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face raw with panic. "Mom, listen," he started, but I lifted a hand, and his words stuttered into silence. "I heard you," I said, my voice low, deliberate. "Every word on that phone call, the one-way ticket, the lover, the debts you thought I'd never know about." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked like a boy caught sneaking candy, not a man caught plotting his own mother's end. Mom. That wasn't what it sounded like. I was angry. You were planning my disappearance. My tone cut through his protest, leaving no air for excuses. Don't you dare pretend otherwise. His shoulders sagged, the mask slipping. He pressed both hands to his face and groaned, then dropped them, eyes wet, voice breaking. "I didn't mean it. I was desperate. They're after me. You don't understand. I didn't know what else to do." I stared, steady as stone. "So you sold me for your debts?" "No." He lurched closer, falling to his knees, as if the floor had given way. "Please, Mom. I'll fix it. I'll change. Just give me another chance. Don't leave me with nothing." The sight might once have undone me, my son kneeling, begging, tears streaking his face. But I felt no pull, no tenderness rising to meet his plea. Instead, there was a cold clarity, a recognition of every choice he had made leading here. I leaned down close enough for him to see the steadiness in my eyes. "You tried to erase me, Dorian. Now I erase you." He sobbed, reached for my hand, but I drew it back as if from fire. I stepped around him, climbed the stairs slowly, each tread measured. Behind me, his cries filled the hallway, but I did not look back. At the top, I turned into my bedroom, closed the door, and locked it. My suitcase waited by the bed, my journal resting on the quilt. I sat down, smoothed the leather cover with my palm, and felt the silence wrap itself around me again. Tomorrow would bring the next step. The next morning, I rose before the sun, dressed with care, and drove downtown to the courthouse. The city was just stirring shopkeepers, raising shutters, lawyers in pressed suits, hurrying with coffee in hand. I walked steadily among them, a woman who had decided at last to place the truth in writing. Filing for legal protection was a strange kind of liberation. The clerk took my petition, stamped it, and guided me through the process. I signed papers, severing all financial ties, no joint accounts, no lingering obligations. My name and his would no longer share a ledger. The ink dried quickly, as if eager to end the bond. Weeks passed in hearings, but I carried myself with composure. The judge listened patiently as evidence was laid out: the debts, the false pretenses, the reckless spending. Dorian sat across the aisle, thinner, restless, his eyes darting at every mention of his failures. He spoke when asked, but his words lacked conviction, collapsing under the weight of his own contradictions. When the judgment came, it was clean and final. Assets were divided, my portion safeguarded, his left bare to creditors. I walked out of the courtroom with my head high, the gavel's echo still ringing like a seal of freedom. The rumors spread quickly through Charleston. Whispers at real estate offices, murmurs in cafes. Dorian's name, once polished, grew tarnished overnight. His lover, so certain of his wealth, his promises vanished, leaving him to face the wreckage alone. I heard it not with spite, but with the quiet confirmation that truth has a way of surfacing. I returned home that evening to the magnolia shadows swaying across my porch. I brewed tea, sat by the window, and wrote in my journal. Balance restored, but respect still to be claimed. The house felt different now, not a cage, not a stage, but a place of decision. My story had not ended with the verdict. It had only reached a pause, a moment of stillness, before the next choice I would make. And as I closed the journal and set it on the table, I knew the next chapter of my life was already waiting for me. Months passed, and Charleston settled into its familiar rhythms again. The hum of cicadas in the heat, the magnolia blossoms drifting like slow snow, the tide pushing against the shore with its patient insistence. I found myself most evenings on the porch, the wicker chair beneath me worn smooth by time, a glass of sweet tea sweating in my hand. The storms had quieted. No court summons in the mail, no frantic knocks at the door. Dorian's shadow still lingered in whispers from town, but it no longer reached me. The house, once tense with secrets, had returned to its silence. Not empty, peaceful. Beside me on the small table sat my journal, leather worn softer with every page filled. I opened it sometimes just to see what I had kept within its covers. Between the lines of ink, I had slipped 2 pieces of paper, the unused cruise ticket stub marked one way, solo cabin, and the flight receipt from Nassau to Charleston. One meant erasure, the other meant return. Together, they told the story of a choice no one else could make for me. I traced my fingers over the papers, letting the edges remind me of what had been risked, what had been won. The past no longer tightened its grip on my chest. It simply lived here, pressed between pages, proof that I had survived my own unraveling and stitched myself back together. Sometimes, when the evening air was still, I thought of the word home. For so long, it had meant duty, sacrifice, the endless weight of someone else's needs. Now, it meant something quieter, the freedom to sit with my own thoughts, to choose who crossed my threshold, to decide when silence should remain unbroken. The key to the front door hung, as it always had, on the small hook inside the hall. But there was another I kept in the drawer beside my bed, wrapped in a strip of linen. A spare. Not for Dorian, not for anyone who mistook blood for entitlement. It was for someone who might one day come with respect in hand, not demand. I lifted the glass of tea, cold and sweet on my tongue, and whispered into the heavy air. I still keep a spare key. Respect first, entry second. The cicadas sang louder, the porch light flickered on, and the night leaned close, as if waiting for my answer to a question I had yet to speak aloud. Outline Ch1, the envelope, 650 words, Ch2, memories anchored, 650, Ch3, excuses in the air, 650, K4, the wrong moment, 650, Act 2, the mask and the plan, Ch5, a smile in the dark, 600 T, 6, withdrawal, 650 T, 7, port of departure, 650 R, 8, salt in the air, 600 Act 3, twists on the tide, Chi 9, an unexpected witness, 650 R, 10, storm of messages, 600 T, 11, the letter under the door, 650 Ki 12, the spare ticket, 650, Act 4, reversal of power, 13, echoes on deck, 650, return to shore, 650, 15, the confrontation, 600 Act 5, liberation, 16, court of balance, 600, TARS, 17, the spare key finale, 600.